I'm the I'm the program manager for Echoes and Reflections. And we're talking about justice, life, and memory. We have a new unit that I actually wrote and was released earlier this year. So something that's kind of really exciting and in this realm, and also something I think can really help with your students to talk about how we remember things in a broad way, depending on what your district is, what your state says, what your politicians say. So, always easier to talk about hard topics and memory and justice when it's not talking about American history. So hopefully this will help you also open up those conversations too. If you are willing and able, and hopefully we'll give you some good skills to be able to do that. I'm also a former high school teacher, and I have a master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I'm a PhD student as well. So I have a little bit of a background in this. If you don't know Echoes and Reflections, we're a joint program with the Anti-Defamation League, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. We've been around since 2005, mostly helping teachers, doing professional development like this for over 100,000 educators since then, but also kind of delving into direct student work with our self-directed student activities and our timeline of the Holocaust, and some other kind of really exciting programs that we have. And hopefully you'll get a good sense of some of the stuff that we offer today. We always start with our pedagogical principles. These are our North Star that guide us into what we're trying to accomplish and what we try to do. Today we're definitely thinking about making the Holocaust relevant. So thinking about how memory affects us, how justice is carried out or not carried out. We'll use some primary source materials, and we'll definitely teach the human story and try to understand the victims, their journey after the Holocaust, as well as trying to figure out society as well as we kind of go through. So with this, we always kind of like to start with a quote to kind of ground us in our hopes of trying to accomplish this unit. And there's a profound difference between history and memory. History is information. Memory, by contrast, is part of identity. And hopefully this also kind of teaches us or shows us why memory is so powerful, is such a lightning rod, is so important and influential in our society of how do we remember things. History is mostly facts, although it's also the interpretation of facts, but how we remember that history really becomes part of who we are as our identity. And so we kind of jump through 4 major topics here. And the first one is justice. And I know, Jamie, that you're eating, so feel free to jump in if you'd like, or I can kind of just talk through this as well. Kind of really just overall, just whatever you want out of this session. Hopefully we can provide that for you. But when we think about justice, maybe we think about punishment, maybe we think about karma or getting what you deserve, maybe we think about closure, maybe we think about an end point, that once someone gets justice, the ending is finally occurred. We think about court systems, maybe we think about more than just the trial, or more than just going to jail or the death penalty, but also thinking about ostracization or suffering of perpetrators. We can also kind of think about incomplete, or that it never actually achieves its full goal. If we're thinking about genocide, obviously there probably is no such thing as of complete justice. So, what does that mean to the individual? What does that mean to the society? What does that mean to certain groups, whether they were the perpetrators or whether they were the victims, or all of the other categories in between? So hopefully we've kind of delved through some of that. So, justice first, and I kind of want to just share the kind of major lessons as we kind of walk through this, and hopefully get some of your thoughts as well. Totally up to you. But the first, I want to, one of the things that we do when we talk about justice is we talk about war crimes, we talk about the International Military Tribunal, we talk about Nuremberg, and we talk about the dozens or hundreds of cases after that. We also often talk about how many of the perpetrators were never found were never tried, were never punished, and the ones that were punished were often minimally punished. There wasn't a lot of appetite to charge Nazis, period, wherever we were, as well as the threat of communism that kind of was overshadowing all of Europe at this time. And so we always kind of want to bring back the victim's voice here too. So I want to offer this poem to start. This poem is by Dan Pagis. He's born in Romania in 1930. He survives the camps. He escapes and eventually emigrates to Free State Israel in 1946. He becomes a writer, a poet, a professor, and he died in Israel in 1986. He's a pretty prolific writer of poetry. And I want to kind of give you a couple of minutes to take a look at this poem that he writes, a draft of a reparations agreement. I have highlighted one small section, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, kind of totally open-ended. I've given a few guiding questions as well, but take a couple of minutes, read the poem, and then we can chat about it. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Would anyone like to share your thoughts, or I can talk through them too. All right. Well, originally we might think of reparations, and especially if we're thinking in the U.S. climate, we're thinking about reparations for enslavement of African Americans mostly. So maybe your students will think of that and think of all of the loaded amount of that topic carries. But when we think about reparations, we want to think about it really is a statement of justice for a future society to look back in the past of its mistakes and address them in a meaningful way that builds a community, that heals a community, and that tries to move forward and progress as a society. And so if we read Dan's poem here, we're thinking he talks a lot, and there's a lot of imagery of everything being put back the way it was. So everything returned to its place. The fear and the terror brought, screams back into the throat, the gold teeth back into the gums, and eventually, the smoke back into the chimney. And really talking about why or what could possibly be offered as reparations that would come close to justice, or come close to, trying to make things right. And so there's this great cynicism and doubt and despair in this poem, and he juxtaposes that, putting all of these horrible things back into its place with, look, you'll have your life back, you'll sit in your living room, read the evening paper, here you are, nothing is too late. And of course, as he's writing, he knows that everything has changed, whether that is for those that were murdered or for those that survived. There is no reparations. That what kind of draft could you even make that could even compare to trying to make things right, or even trying to repent for the sins of Nazi Germany and their collaborators. And so kind of a really powerful voice of the victim here. and a great setup to kind of the rest of this unit. So as we kind of go forward about living with this memory of the Holocaust, we think about some of the major touch points in history after 1945 that become really watershed moments of our understanding. So right after the war, largely because of war crimes trials, there's tons of documentation. From the very beginning, there are people that are in displaced persons camps that are interviewing survivors and trying to figure out what happened. There's documentation, there's collecting of all of these resources, and then it really goes silent. There's the Europe is basically destroyed. 60 million people have died in Europe. There's been total destruction, whether it's the firebombing from the Allies or the scorched earth policy of Nazi Germany, that most of these countries are really suffering. And so no one wants to hear about Holocaust survivors. They don't want to hear their stories because they suffered during the war too. And no one wants to hear doom and gloom. They want to move forward. And we get that a lot from survivors as well, that they wanted to rebuild their lives. They wanted to look forward because there was nothing to look back to. Most were not welcome in their homes if they tried to return to their previous dwelling place, and many of their families have been murdered, and most of the time they were moving to a new country with no one they knew, not knowing the language often, and working to kind of rebuild from the ground up. And so a lot of that changes in 1960 and 1961, which is the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann. He's captured, he's brought to Israel on trial. He is tried in Israel in 61 and eventually found guilty and hanged. And this becomes a real catalyst for testimony and for survivors to start speaking. So we're talking about 15, 16, 17 years after the end of the war. And it's still not well received, but it's starting to be, people are starting to listen, really. And for the first time, people are starting to listen. For the first time that survivors are starting to speak. And this is also the time when we start to really begin our long process of accepting and recognizing that testimony is a valuable primary source. So I want to introduce you to Fritzi Fritzschall here. She was born in August of 1931. She's from Czechoslovakia. She was incarcerated in a ghetto in Italy, eventually made it to Auschwitz. She's got this crazy story. Her father had immigrated to the US before the war, but couldn't get the rest of her family out. And just, she ends up being caught in the Nazi web. So I do want to kind of show you the website too, and all of these resources are open sourced and they're online, and they're easy to go. And so if you go to echoesandreflections.org, we're in the teach section here, which will open up this page. Our lesson plans are over here, and we're in unit 10 of Justice, Life, and Memory. You'll notice the quote, the standards, it's tied to national curriculum standards. You'll have guiding questions. Everything is step by step and really simple. You'll see the poem here that we talked about already is in this first lesson. And as we hear, I want to introduce you to Fritzi, and she's just going to talk about why she decided to tell her story.
There were 600 of us working in this factory, and I was the youngest there. So there, in that factory, because I was the youngest, I had 599 mothers. It was like, are we going to survive? If we survive, who's going to tell the story? Who's going to believe us? Who's going to carry on? And so it was always, someone needs to live to let the world know what happened in this craziness, in these dark days, in this murder factory. And so I was the youngest, and so 599 women allowed me extra rest whenever they could, because it was very hard to do so, and allowed me a little bit more food. And when I say a little bit more food, if you hold on your hand and you make a fist, Each one gave a crumb of their starving food to me. But in turn, I had to make a promise that if I survived, I would carry the message of all of them and for all that I saw and lived with. And so I made a promise that if I lived, I would tell the story. And so I came to this country as a teenager. Couldn't and wouldn't handle my past. Couldn't deal with it. And so I took all my memories and put them in the bottom of my brain, never to be taken out to be examined. I remember my dad sitting down with me and asking me, do I know what happened to his wife, my mother? Do I know what happened to my brothers? Do I know what happened to the family? And I looked at him and I said, we're going to talk about this once, but we're never going to talk about this again. And we didn't, because I couldn't. When the museum in Skokie was built, this little museum, they started to put out newsletters asking for survivors to come forward and tell their stories. I was part of that community, but they never knew my story because I never told it. And this is when my story was recorded, and this is where I became the survivor. I remember I was being interviewed in Erna's home, and I had a friend with me, and it was not a great interview, but it was an interview. And I walked out to the car with my friend, and I sat down in the car, and this is where the floodgates opened. This is where I became hysterical. This is where I became the survivor. And this is where I realized I need to do what I need to do because I made a promise, and this is why I'm sitting here today.
And so that's Fritzi giving you a little bit of her story of why she survived and also why she started to speak out. So again, if you want to share some of your thoughts about why a survivor would want to tell their story, or what are some of the challenges, the benefits, the detriments, something that you heard, or anything like that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Am I the only one in here?
Yeah, you are now.
Okay.
All you,
Then I will
Jamie.
just speak rather than type if that's okay. I
Yeah.
think a lot of it was just so traumatic. I teach history obviously, and I do a big Holocaust unit myself, and I've had survivors speak to my students I'm in Las Vegas, so we have a high population of Holocaust survivors. But I think when they did start speaking, it was just very therapeutic for them, is what most of them have told me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a way for them to kind of just share their story, much like therapy with survivors that, especially in terms that survivors that speak often, they usually kind of not create, but they get a story, a cadence. This is how they're going to tell their story with these kind of touch points. And so that allows them to avoid what's most painful, but also allows them to share their story multiple times to different groups and different people, and in a way that is powerful without being too damaging or traumatic to them.
Or to the students. And my kids are 8th grade. Sometimes I teach 7th grade, and some, you have to be sensitive to your audience too. You can't be too graphic to these younger kids, but I had the one gentleman I have, he was just great. And the kids, you could hear a pin drop.
Yeah, yeah, it really is something really special. And so when we hear Fritzy's story here, she mentioned Skokie. She's talking about in 1978 there was a white supremacist rally in Skokie, Illinois. That's when they created the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and she lived in that community. And no one knew her story. Like, Illinois has plenty of German and plenty of Czech immigrants from the 1800s on. So it wasn't weird to have European immigrants after the war, and they didn't know that she was a Holocaust survivor. They had no idea. And so
Yeah.
I think I love her thoughts of being like, that's when I became a survivor, that like I'm a survivor now. And that was always part of her identity, and yet that wasn't something that she claimed.
Well, I think that's a process too. You just have to process. I can't imagine processing, living through something like that and having to process it, being the only survivor out of this group or my family or whatever. Like, I think I'd rather die.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And so Fritzy kind of teaches us a lot of things. She teaches us the great benefits of hearing her story, which you've been able to see firsthand, right, from hearing stories of survivors. We also get a lot of her challenges. It doesn't change her identity, but it makes her more aware of one aspect of who she is as a person, which can be challenging. Obviously, it is emotionally challenging as she cries and she has to bring back these memories every time she tells her story. And yet there's also this sense of duty and obligation that we hear from survivors, and we hear from her about, well, this was a promise I made. And so I know it's painful, but I owe it to my family, to the people that helped me, to the people who were murdered. So we have a lot of complexity there. And so as we kind of like move through this unit about justice and life and memory, we also have to kind of understand, or at least kind of have a cursory understanding of what trauma is and some of the effects, which is really difficult to do because the effects of trauma are widespread, they're varied, they manifest themselves in many different ways. There's some debate about whether trauma is passed down. Many psychologists kind of use the idea of echoes of traumatic memories. So not that it gets passed down, but that because your parents, your grandparents suffered trauma, that they, raise you in different ways, or there are aspects of your childhood or your relationship with them that is different because of the trauma that they went through. And some of these reactions can include irritation, distrust of the world. We've also seen in studies resilience and the ability to cope as well. And so it's really interesting that we see kind of the entire gamut of how one deals with trauma with Holocaust survivors and their descendants, from those that had really difficult upbringings, that have had difficulty connecting with their parents, to those that learned resilience and coping mechanisms and perseverance. And so it really kind of just depends on the person and how they processed. And our unit has some really great artwork that kind of shows us that. I want to look at a few examples. One here is from Yehuda Bacon, or Bacon. He's born in 1929, Czechoslovakia. He survives the camps and eventually emigrates to pre-state Israel as well, and becomes a pretty renowned artist. And here he has, in memory of the Czech transport to the gas chambers, and you have this charcoal drawing that he draws, really graphic and powerful. And with that, I wanted to offer kind of these other two artworks that are found throughout our units. One is found in our liberation unit, one is found in this unit, the unit 10 of Justice, Life, and Memory. And yet they're really similar. And so the one on the left is Children Alone by Samuel Bach. Samuel Bach is from Vilna, Lithuania. He survives a labor camp and escapes, and he hides in a monastery, and then moves to Israel and lives in Israel for his life. And the one on the right is by Martin Spett. who was born in Poland. He hid under floorboards before he was arrested and sent to the camp Bergen-Belsen, because his mother was actually a US citizen, and had returned to Poland, to, she was Polish, and even though she had her US citizenship, she moved to Poland, and then they got trapped there. And he eventually immigrates to the US. And what I find really interesting about these is that they are similar topics, right? It's in children alone, my sister and I, so it looks like a brother and sister, or at least we can kind of assume that from Bach's painting on the left. And Samuel Bach on the left painted this in 1948, and Martin Spett painted this very similar painting in 1993, over 40 years later. And so, love to talk through these, or just have you contemplate them as well, and I can talk through them, of kind of some of the emotions that you see, some tone, what can we infer from two paintings that are so similar, but they're 45 years apart? Kind of any of these questions as we kind of.
Well, you'd be having students analyze them, like isolation is just kind of what pops in my head with both of them, and loneliness and.
Yeah, like it's very abstract in terms of like the watercolor on the left. There's no real, there's mountains in the distance, and but there's not a lot of clarity moving forward.
Almost kind of lost with the one on the left too. I almost like they're just lost wandering around.
Yeah, and that's similar but a little bit different to the one on the right. They have a suitcase, and yet the background is obviously they're walking in a city or a town, and the buildings are up, but they are not defined clearly.
Yeah, I guess it's still kind of that lost. Like that one on the right is kind of like a fog, so they're still kind of lost in this fog, sort of. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah, and so when we think about this in terms of, like how survivors deal with the trauma and go on with their lives in some way, we can infer lots of things. One of them is that, they never really move on from it, that this is the defining trauma of their life, and that nothing changes that. We get that in some of our testimonies as well. I think maybe Fritzi, maybe not the best example, but you get it a little bit, where when she talks about her experience in the camp, that she feels transposed to it, that she's reliving it, that she's stuck there. And we hear this from survivors as well. And so, that we have two paintings 45 years apart, and yet they are very similar in their tone, in their, in their creation, in their use of fog and, lack of clarity, and even with the two kind of walking together, and looking at their backs, of being like unclear where they're headed. And yet we hear that and we see that, and yet life does go on, right? That the people that drew these live lives, full lives of, into adulthood and careers, and painted some, Samuel Bach was an artist, so he painted all the time. He's a renowned Israeli artist. Martin Spett designed women's handbags in New Jersey in the garment district, and built a career and a family and a life, and yet they can draw really similar paintings so far apart. So so much to kind of understand there. And I think that in this section, what we really want to do is challenge our students not to have answers, but to just think about this, to critically think, to infer, to question, to try to understand, to empathize, the way that trauma kind of displays itself and manifests itself. And some of these stories are, some that I've heard that I've always found powerful is, things that, we wouldn't see necessarily, we'd see as odd, but we don't know why. So for example, someone who, has to sleep with the lights on, or I know a survivor that slept with her purse underneath her pillow every night, or with Thanksgiving coming up there, survivors often, will not leave any food on their plate, or they won't wait. Once the food is served, they start eating no matter what. Or I know one person whose mother is a survivor, and she will eat the meat off the carcass of the turkey, because doesn't want to go to waste, that kind of thing. So some kind of idiosyncrasies that also kind of relate and show some of these traumatic background and how people cope and live their lives and deal with it. So none of those are answers, but they're all very important to kind of think about. With kind of 10 minutes left, we have a couple of things. I actually want to maybe jump back to the unit just to kind of show you a couple of things as we have a minute here of talking about this. That was Fritzy, and kind of talking about some of the background, some of the artwork of survivors. We have a really great thing about studies of human behavior that were kind of inspired by the Holocaust. So whether that's the Milgram experiment or the third wave experiment, kind of looking at how this event had people question how could this have happened, and then try to better understand human behavior. And the third lesson here talks about the memorialization of the Holocaust, about why do we remember, how that memory becomes part of our identity. And one of the things that this does that is really interesting that I want to kind of talk about, one specific example, is look at Holocaust memorials in Europe and kind of do the see, think, wonders on these, or have students try to understand what's missing, what's part of this, where is this located, and really just kind of delve into memory and what memorials and museums can do and how they function in a society. And so just kind of giving you a few examples. That's the Umschlagplatz in Warsaw. We're going to talk about the Stolperstein in a second, and then we have the shoes on the Danube that are really powerful.
Yeah, I've been to Warsaw. That was just around the corner from our hotel was a remnant of the wall of the ghetto too. So very powerful.
Yeah, and so this is just like a really great activity that just takes a couple, and again uses Europe as the example, just because it's so much easier to think about how other places remember than how we remember. But just that, this is the Umschlagplatz, and there's like an apartment building next to it. That this was the place that 500,000 Jews were stuck in, and over 300,000 I believe will gather in this area and be deported and murdered in places like Treblinka. And yet there's an apartment building next to it, there's a park, and kind of talk about memorial structures like that. And so one that is kind of an interesting one that I always like to kind of bring up is about how these memorials don't just tell us about the event that happened or the event that it memorializes. It can also teach you about the society that built it, whether that's the people that designed it, the people that paid for it, the place of which it stands. All of those things obviously tell us about the event that it memorializes, but it also tells you about the community that built it. And so one of those kind of really interesting memorial concepts or designs is the Stolperstein, literally stumbling blocks or stumbling stones, where they're placed throughout Europe, and a few through Germany, and there's some in Czech Republic, and there's some in other places that have a small detail about this is where this person lived. They were deported and murdered on this date.
And there was some issues with that too, where people thought, oh, they're just going to be walked on and disregarded, but the idea was for people to kneel to be able to read them, and
yeah, and so there's so much debate about these why we wanted to bring them into this, about what it says about a community that wants to tell you the story of the people and the neighborhood that existed in that place, tell you about the people that lived there, at least a small amount of that, and also kind of hope and a belief that these memorials can impact the current and future generation of remembering them, or remembering this place, or thinking about what this town, state, country looked like, and who lived there and what it was like. before now, right? So the hope being of memory, but also one of you know, the history of a community, the history of a city, being important as we kind of learn our identity as well. And so this is not in here, but I always think it's interesting that there is a memorial in Berlin, and it's made out of the stones of a synagogue that stood there. The synagogue actually survived the war, was untouched, it crystal knocked, it was never defaced or anything. It was just kind of left empty. And then after the war is when they destroyed the synagogue and built like a kindergarten. And there's a memorial outside the kindergarten, and it says, you know, in memory of this synagogue and the people that attended, but there was no use for it anymore. And so the synagogue had survived, but none of its congregants had. And so it was an empty building, and there was no
That's
claim to
interesting.
it.
I've never heard that. That's interesting
Yeah,
and
so
sad.
very sad. And very interesting that this did not get destroyed. The building survived, but none of the people did. And now that the kindergarten there every year does something where they lay a brick and they're building like a, you know, they build a wall on their playground kind of thing. And so just another kind of anecdote about memorials and what they mean, and how they impact the society that lives in those places where they are. And so the hope for these stumbling stones, which again, like as you mentioned, it were pretty controversial and remain to be controversial every time a new group or a new city advocates for them, is the balance between defacing them in terms of walking on them, the uncomfortableness and the hesitancy for people that live there, that they want to be reminded of the sins of their ancestors, as well as the positive benefits it can have to help students and people and citizens be confronted with their history, and hopefully in the hopes of them being better citizens, right? And so I want to end with this big question that's usually no, but maybe it's a yes at times. And just another testimony from the famous Jankarski, born in Poland in 1914 in Lodz, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire until the Russian Revolution of 1918. He joins the underground after Poland is defeated really quickly in 1939. He's smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto. He meets with diplomats from Britain and also with Franklin Roosevelt, and he just kind of talks about you know, some instructions and hope that he has for the future. So a good place that I thought to end. So let me find him, and we can just listen to kind of his instructions, and then I'll answer any questions or do anything that I can do to help in the last few minutes. But here's Jankarski.
Great crimes start with little things. You don't like your neighbor. You don't like him because he's black or yellow or café con leche or whatever it is. Avoid this. Avoid disliking people. Try to cooperate. Don't make distinctions. Bad nations, good nations, it's a nonsense. Don't believe in nationalism based on ethnicity. It's a nonsense again. That I am a Pole because my family for generation was Polish, no Germans in my family, Jewish or something. It's a nonsense. There are no clear, pure races. Anyway, this is what else. I am not a prophet. I don't have messages. Humanity is making progress.
So that's Jankarski with a little bit of hope, but also, you know, some words of warning too of, you know, what great crimes start with, but also kind of that overarching sense of how do we relate to one another, which is really what memory is about, what identity is about, of how do we have a collective understanding of the history of the world, of our society, of our people, of our country, of our neighborhood, of our family. All of those things help us to understand identity and memory. And we think back to Fritzi's kind of statements of identity as well, and try and figure out what those kind of powerful messages can be. So that's what I had thought and planned for today. In that, the other kind of selling parts about Echoes and Reflections, we do all of our lesson plans. They're open source. They're all online. Everything that you saw today is free for you on the website. I'm happy to show you more resources if you have a few minutes and want to do that. We also offer plenty of professional development. We offer about 5 to 6 webinars a month, online courses. We have live PD programs as well, virtual and in person. They're all free, supported by donors, and that's what we have. So if you have any thoughts, Jamie, questions, something that I can help you with, I'm happy to do whatever I can in the last 10 minutes or so.
No, I've actually taken several classes where they've, Echoes is one of the references we go to, and we've had to use some of their, I can't remember which one it was. There's some really great graphic organizers on there too. I can't remember off the top of my head because I'm like in 3 other classes right now. But
yeah,
it's a great source. Like, it really is.
Thank you. Yeah, and we updated our 10 units. The last 5, which included the Justice, Life, and Memory unit, was updated earlier this year. And so there's plenty of graphic organizers and student inquiry learning, and all of those really great things. So something that we spent a lot of time with and a lot of work on, and hope that it's being worthwhile and used. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed it. Yeah.
Do you have any, the last thing I can tell you is that we started these new student activities. They're in the Eyewitness platform. We released 5 this past year that you can assign your students. Some of them are kind of the basic foundational of what was the Holocaust or what's contemporary anti-Semitism. We have this really great eye walk that kind of looks at Ika Zygmuntewicz, who's in our final solution unit, and it actually looks at her pre-war life with pictures of current day Poland and where she grew up, and it's tied to testimonies and photographs of hers. It's really cool too. So just one more great resource if you have the opportunity.
Well, I have to look at that anti-Semitism. I'm kind of reformatting my unit into that because, gosh, I don't remember. It was that, I think it was through PBS, but it had that Ken Burns.
Yep.
6-hour documentary, and I was just like, holy shikes! I didn't realize how. I mean, I knew there was anti-Semitism in America. I didn't realize to what extent.
Yeah. I was doing an earlier session, and someone asked me, like, how do we answer, like, why did Hitler hate the Jews so much? And like my first response was like, the people hate Jews just as much as Hitler did now. Like, it wasn't like a one person problem. Like, it's centuries old. And we do, yeah. You seem to be pretty knowledgeable about Echoes, but we also have an online class that is based on that documentary to help you use the documentary in your classroom. I didn't know if you knew about that or if you had seen the emails on that, but we're running another one in December too.
I might have to look on that one. I don't know if it's. I know we used the Echoes. I can't remember if it was for that same class or not. I want to say it was, because there's a whole lesson on anti-Semitism or unit, I should say, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. We did. And for some reason, this session survey is not letting me open up the link.
Do you want me to try again?
Yeah. I mean, do I really have to do it?
Yeah.
Let me try it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like pulling up a different thing for me, and it won't let me type in it to do anything. So I don't know what's going on.
Weird. Okay, I'm gonna try one more thing, and if it doesn't work, that's fine. I just wanna. No, I think that's the same link. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what's going on then.
Because like I even tried to copy and paste it to put it in a new window, and it just says
Yeah.
select all. It won't even let me paste it.
Oh.
Because I've been having to do it for all these sessions all day. None of
Yeah.
them have been working for me the right way. So I don't know what's going on with this.
Oh, that's so strange. I wonder what's happening.
So what should I do? Oh yeah,
Um,
that's the Ken Burns one.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, not the Ken Burns, but that that picture was the one we did.
yeah, we worked with Ken Burns's team and with the US HMM
I
and
bet
with
this is the one
PBS.
I took then. I bet this was the one.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, if you've taken it, then it would be the same one. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you had taken it or if
Yeah, well, the image is
yeah, it's the same. Yeah,
is what I recognize. So yeah, it was a good one.
good. I'm glad we worked a lot on it, obviously, but it's been fun. It's been fun.
I'll have to watch it now. I didn't know that he had a new documentary out. So
You know, 6 hours is such a commitment, but it really is good. I mean,
yeah.
you know, it does a good job of balancing, you know, like America should have done more to help people, but also America did more than anybody else, you know, in winning the war. So there's always that kind of balance.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
Well, not really. I just don't understand why there was such a hatred towards the Jews. Like I can't wrap my brain around it. I mean, I
Yep.
know they've always been persecuted throughout history, and that was already kind of there with Hitler, but I still just, I don't know. I just don't get it.
Yeah, it's 2,000 years of, I mean, it's 4,000 years, but it's really the last 2,000 have been quite brutal. And you think about the impact of the Catholic Church and Christianity and, you know, that
Yeah.
religious
Yeah.
hatred as being a base. And then you add in people believing in, you know, the scientific enlightenment and biology and thinking about race and eugenics. And, you know, so it doesn't matter if you're a religious nut, if you're a scientist, if you're dad on your luck, or you just want a scapegoat, there's always the Jews for it. It's, you know, and if, you know, depending on how much you talk about current events, you know, if you're believing in conspiracy theories, I mean, the conspiracy theories that are out there today are just ones that people believe about Jews for the last thousands of years. So,
Yeah, but
regardless.
Common sense has just been lost.
Yeah, and there's also that like culture of fear. People are afraid, like they're afraid of lots of things. Whether it's, I heard a good speaker talking about migration, that there's been a lot of migration and within the US and within the global world, and people don't like immigrants. They don't, you know, they see immigrants first as a challenge. And so, you know, if you meet your neighbors and they're immigrants and they're nice and friendly, then you can't hate your neighbor. You have to hate something else that, you know, got your neighbor there. And so now you can, you know, hate the people of color, Black people, brown people, whatever. But you could also hate the people pulling the strings. And then there you just have connected a classic anti-Semitic stereotype. So
yeah, take your pick, I guess.
yeah. We do have this kind of full unit on anti-Semitism. There's a great video toolbox about it too that was developed by Yad Vashem that gives you like a good like 11-minute overview of lots of things. And then some really just like some good testimony, obviously, but also some like good graphic organizers, you know, talking about stereotypes.
And some of those videos we had to watch for the class, when I would click on it, the videos weren't working for me. So, I mean, I had to contact the instructor, but I don't, like, who would I contact if that's not working, if I try to do this with my kids?
You can reach right out to us. I'll throw my email. That would be odd.
Yeah.
Some of the only thing I can say is, like, there are some school districts that block YouTube and stuff like that, but outside of that,
Well, yeah, but not for the teachers. Ours does for students, but
Yeah.
not for the teachers.
okay.
It was just weird. I don't know. I don't know if is it compatible with Google, or do I need to be in a different?
It should be compatible with everything, but
It should, yeah, okay.
that's weird.
Yeah, it was, and it was a couple months ago, so I couldn't even tell you what video
Yeah.
it was. That was just some of those little testimonies, but.
The one resource that I'll offer, if you're kind of thinking about it, we have this great summary of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So if you're, I just want to make sure you knew about that, just because it's a great one to break down with your students, like
It is,
give them
yeah.
like different eras. And so it doesn't give you obviously like a really full on view, but it at least like sees how it's scaffolded from religious to medieval times to race to Nazi Germany too. So just kind of shows how it builds, that.
Yeah, that was nice. That was one of the ones I liked too. And gosh, I can't remember where I read it. It seemed like the term anti-Semitism was kind of made up by the Nazis as well, if I remember correctly.
It was coined by Wilhelm Marr in the late 1800s, also a German guy. And we have that in our definition, kind of talks about it. And
maybe that's where I read it then.
Yeah,
probably.
It was just meant to make it sound more scientific.
Mhm.
That that there like that there was a fact and there was evidence. I always think about this definition and look at the first sentence about anti-Semitism is a term for hatred of Jews as a group or a concept that it's not supported by evidence or based on facts, but that it's this irrational, illogical hatred. And so they coined the term to make it sound like it was based on a scientific fact, and then people are more likely to believe it.
Well, they were pretty good at that propaganda.
Yeah, and that's the other big fear. I guess I'll leave you with this thought, although I've enjoyed the conversation, of that propaganda works, that it is hugely successful. And so if you're going to use it in your classroom, which I highly recommend you do, that you make sure you're not just creating anti-Semites out of your kids.
No.
Propaganda works. I think teachers underestimate the power of propaganda because they always think like, my students see hundreds of thousands of images a day, like they'll notice this as being stupid or irrational or illogical, and then they're like, no, like there's a reason propaganda works.
Yeah, no, we make them do a whole like modern propaganda and then comparing to anti-Semitism, and then their final project is kind of like a positive propaganda type. With something negative in the world today, how can you turn that and make it a positive thing?
Yeah, that's great. Well, Jamie, I definitely appreciate the time. Sorry that there wasn't you only got to talk to me and not others, but
that's
hopefully
okay.